Good afternoon, David, and thanks to all of you for joining us.
Matt, thanks for having me, and good afternoon, everybody. It's good to, although I love Chicago, it snowed there 10 days ago, so.
Well, it's been kind of chilly outside this morning, too. So, Obama Foundation is getting up and running. What is your yardstick for success for the foundation?
It was October of 2016, Matt, and the president called me into the Oval and he said, imagine if over the course of the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, we find 1 million Barack Obamas and we find 1 million Michelle Obamas and we connect them to each other. And then the things that they do both in the United States and overseas will be exponentially greater than what we do. And embedded in that connection, when people who are really focused on making their communities better, you begin to see then the yardsticks of success. There is a program called the Obama Fellows, and Matt, to give you a sense of the scale of this, we picked 20 individuals for a 2-year non-residential fellowship. We received 22,000 applications to select these 20. And after a year, a story of Harry Grammer in Los Angeles partnering with Keith Watley in Oakland, who had never met. And Harry is now turning juvenile detention centers into vocational technical centers with the help of Keith Watley in Oakland. And we didn't tell them what to do. All we did was essentially take these two extraordinary people, connect them to one another, surround them with an ecosystem of people who wanted to be helpful with them, and they're making their communities better. And so in a lot of ways, that becomes the prototype for the type of network that we want to build.
Yeah. So our conversation this afternoon is about civics education. What is the role of civics education in your portfolio and the portfolio of the organization, and why have you prioritized civics?
So by the time you get to the Harry Grammers or the Keith Watleys or the Kuketsu in South Africa who are in their 30s, you've missed an entire generation of people. And so imagine if you can go into K through 12. Imagine if you can get young people essentially coming out, and while learning the 3 branches of government at a minimum is important, while learning that you have the responsibility to engage in your democracy as a citizen and a participant is important, there's something much deeper than that, which is that notion of I have agency, I have a voice, I have power. I need not think about my participation in a democracy as my ceding that power to a representative who will act, in the best case, on my behalf. But what are my responsibilities to it? And so we have a partnership with the Chicago Public School District, and we're going to announce some awards at the end of this month, which is essentially our experiential civics awards. So what is the example of the student who brought together his peers in his class to help clean up a park, didn't wait for anybody else, but said, there's a problem, I have a responsibility to fix it? How about the teacher who said, as you learn about the alderman and the mayor and about the president and about Congress, where do you fit in? How can you express your active citizenship in an open way? And so in some ways, civics for me and Civics 101 for the Obama Foundation goes back to something that, whether you agreed with President Obama or disagreed with President Obama, when he launched this campaign in 2007, there was a riff that he would talk about, which was one voice can change a room can change a neighborhood, one neighborhood can change a city, can change a state, can change a country in the world. But implicit in that, Matt, is that notion of that one individual with power and agency to basically stand up and say, not just I have rights, because too often a discussion about civics or citizenship devolves to simply the view of the rights that I have, which are important and we need to zealously guard them. But here's the other piece. What are my responsibilities? How do I fit into this society in a sense of community, especially with people that I disagree with, or people who look differently than I do, or who come from a different place? In some ways, our education system is exactly where that is nourished for the first time.
Now, one of the questions that I hear a fair amount from civics educators is, how do you teach civics in 2019? We had a midterm election in 2018 where the largest expansion of voting rights since the Voting Rights Act happened in Florida. Thanks to a ballot initiative in Florida, voting rights were restored to individuals who'd been convicted of felonies. And then, after the election, there was effort by the legislature. There has been successful efforts by the legislature to put restrictions on that broadening of voting rights. One of the stories that's unfolded across the country has been incursions on voting rights in place after place. And so how do you speak to individual students about their rights or responsibilities in a democracy in that context?
Florida is a perfect example where one of the most striking things about the Parkland students after the tragedy was how they understood what their power wasn't just the protest, and it wasn't just the march, but it was working in communities that then go before the Florida legislature and engaging with the individual senator and the member of the House of Representatives around a very detailed agenda. But what they understood was, when you go into that room with that member of the legislature, how are they thinking about this? What is the power mapping that I have to do so that when this senator is thinking about this piece of legislation that I am giving her, how can I bring a coalition of people that will make her open to it and responsive to it? That is a function of not simply reacting to what's happening and saying, well, I need to vote people out. It's, okay, how can I make this better? So, what is my voice? Where does it fit in? What is the issue that I care most about? And what's the way to think about it? How can I draw a power map that allows me to see either the mayor, the state senator, the state representative, a member of Congress, or the president? When they hear me, how are they going to think about? And then finally, in an asset inventory or coalition building, when I go before that state senator, who is she going to pay attention to immediately when I walk in the door? That isn't simply a whiteboard example of how power works. It's a piece of that. But embedded in that is that student, you saying to them, don't wait for anyone else. You do it. So that's the first example. The other thing that you and I talked about.
We had a brief conversation backstage.
And I just wouldn't stop talking. I get excitable. Hopefully that's not coming across. You know, it is so easy to fixate on Washington, Congress, the president, the Supreme Court. But the truth of the matter is, when teachers and students leave the building, they're walking into a community with problems. They're walking into a community where things need to be done there. Yes, pay attention to what's happening in this amazing city, but if you want to teach something, there is nothing more powerful than, even as you're talking about climate change, there is a stream or a lake or a river that needs some engagement in your community, and that experiential hands-on engagement, that then you use that problem as a way to express where you, student, fits in, not just with this thing you care about, but as part of a broader society. It has to be both. It can't just be all eyes focusing on what's happening in this beautiful place.
Yeah. In a moment, I'm going to turn to some of the questions that come through the Slido system, so I'll encourage all of you to go to slido.com and enter your questions with the code. You know, President Obama has sometimes been criticized for the message that he brings to young folks, and particularly to young black folks, I would say, that it is a message that can sound hectoring. It can sound like he's placing a lot of onus on kids to try to fix on the youngest, our youngest Americans at a moment when their rights are being impeded, to try to fix a broken system. And a lot of the message that I hear back from some of President Obama's critics is, Obama, get your people. Like, the system itself is is deeply challenged, and how do you expect us to shoulder all the responsibility through civic involvement for fixing it? What do you say to those critics?
I say those critics aren't listening, and what those critics need to do is to take a look at something like My Brother's Keeper. My Brother's Keeper was developed coming out of the Trayvon Martin murder. And what the president did at that moment in time 5 years ago was essentially not just talk about what young men like Trayvon were going through, but essentially then convene at a systemic level, police chiefs, law enforcement, and others, around an agenda to begin to fix some of the systemic problems. That is one approach. And then when you look at a convening we just had in Oakland, California, where 1,800 young men and boys of color and the organizations that support them convened in Oakland to share best practices, understand ways to move the agenda broadly, both at the individual level and the systemic level. That's the work. And so it's easy for some to paint a very kind of binary and uninformed picture of actually the very systemic and individual level approach. There was a young man at the MBK Summit who was listening to one of the Obama fellows, an African-American man, tell his story and how he is making his community better. As the young men in the room reflected on what they heard, this young man stands up and says, I don't have a question, but I have a comment to make. And my comment is that I am not alone, and I will never act alone, because what I have seen here today is an entire network of people who are leading individual fights like I am in my community. And now I know I have a brotherhood and a fellowship of people to take this with me, not just individually, but more broadly. That's how change happens.
Speaking of the fellows, one of our questions is from Mary Catherine Chase, who asks if you could elaborate on the intended impact of the Obama Fellows and why international fellows particularly are key to the future of civic engagement.
So our fellowship program, as I said, is a 2-year non-residential program. And what we do with each one of them is we engage in a very lengthy, essentially, gap analysis that they inform us about what their inhibitors are. What are those things that are limiting them from going from good to great? And then once we work through that with them, we then reach out to the broader Obama network and say, okay, if you need help with fundraising, here are 3 or 4 people who are expert at it to engage with you. If you need help on project management or communications, here's the resources. And so, not uniquely, but in a way that's powerful, we can reach thousands upon thousands of people who want to help these young men and women to take them to the next level. And so that's what the fellowship idea is about. In Africa, last year, in the celebration of Mandela's 100th birthday, we convened 200 African leaders from throughout the continent, 44 of the 54 nations, 5 days of training in Johannesburg. And then they went back to their communities. They broke off into accountability groups, their names, not ours, of 20. And over the course of the year, every single month, convening, learning, telling us what they needed, because one of the things that we have done in Africa and we do in every community throughout the country that is part of the ethos, you never go into a community and present like you think you have all the answers for them. The answers are there. And so what we say to them is, how can we be the most helpful to your needs in your vision, and how can we bring you along? And what this young woman in Ghana said was that she was expecting us to go in, like many organizations do, and say that Africa and African leaders need to do A, B, C, and D. Never once. She has voice. She has power. All of the people around her have power, and it is now her responsibility as a leader to basically catalyze that and bring that together from bottom up rather than from Washington or Chicago or some other place. But that applies in communities throughout the country. One of the members of the MBK team has a wonderful expression, which is nothing about us without us, which is an important lesson for everybody to learn, even in a civics content.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you for your answers this afternoon, and thanks again to all of you for this conversation.